Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I do feel that's a pretty intense talk to follow. Amazing. And so my content is going to be a bit more prosaic, but I hope it's of interest. I want to talk about how to enhance content discovery in a very different era for the ways in which students, researchers, and faculty are engaging with publisher content. So I'm going to just introduce myself briefly to explain where I'm coming from, and then I'd like to look at access problems, so the problems of actually accessing publisher content, and then the problems of discovery as well, how we can enhance discovery of the content that we all produce. So I don't want to repeat anything, but the perspectives that I bring to this are partly from technology from Sage, which is the EdTech division within Sage Publishing that focuses on services for libraries. And we have a couple of different tools that try to address some of these issues. But also, as a PhD student myself, I've experienced them firsthand. So I want to give my personal perspective on just how difficult it is to access publisher content. And I am generally very interested as well in the wider space and have been in some of these large organizations like Clarivate and others, so I'm very mindful of the competitiveness and how important it is that publishers put their best feet forward. So to explain technology from Sage, we have three main areas of focus with what we consider to be library content, because libraries are our customers, but for our talk we can consider to be publisher content at the center. Our specific focus is on trying to amplify the power of the academic library to support their students and researchers. So our context is that we think the role of the library is changing dramatically, with students and researchers increasingly going outside of traditional library tools to the open web and to all of these new tools, some of which David described. And so in a way, it's a kind of existential moment for the library where it needs to evolve and change the kind of services they provide to students and researchers at the university. So our focus is effectively on increasing their value and putting them at the center of that. But in a way, it's also supporting the publisher role, because ultimately what libraries care a lot about is their collection, of which a lot comes from publisher subscriptions. So the first area we focus on is on guided and open discovery. So we have a reading list solution, Talis Aspire, which basically helps faculty and libraries connect the kind of content that they want to put into their programs into the learning management system. So in that particular system, for example, a lot of your publisher content would be housed, and it's probably the primary route for undergraduates reaching publisher content, taking the guidance from faculty on what they need to read. We also look at open discovery, and I'm going to be showing you some insights and some particular use cases around that. And what we have there is a browser extension that library users can download, and the idea is to bring almost like a virtual assistant from the library into their online workflow, so that when they're on Google, Google Scholar, Wikipedia, and those the common places they now research and learn, the library can bring in its areas of expertise and service, which includes publisher content that they've invested in. We also focus on how to improve access with Lean Library Access, and then again, that's also a browser extension, and I'll show you how that works. And then finally, we focus on engagement. So once students have this content, how do we encourage them to meaningfully engage in it and make the most out of it? And there we have tools around collaborative annotation and reference management and authorship. So to look first of all at access, we did a report last year called Librarian Futures, where we were really trying to articulate what the role of the library could be in the future. And a big part of the focus was looking at current user workflows. We surveyed 4,000 librarians and patrons in terms of students and researchers that use the library across 1,500 institutions globally, and we also supported it with interviews, user data, and student studies, where we followed them in their workflows. And I wanted to share with you some of the key findings. I imagine some of these will be very familiar to you, but the first of which is that modern patron workflows, so the workflows of both students and researchers, begin overwhelmingly outside of the library. So 80% of faculty and 75% of students begin their discovery process outside the library, so they're no longer using those really big discovery services that the library invests so much in. Most of them are starting on Google Scholar or Google. About 50% of the usage that we see through Lean Library begins on either Google or Google Scholar, and the rest of it is direct to content, so either through social posts or recommendations from friends. A very small fraction actually is from other established discovery services like Web of Science, Scopus, and others. And by the way, these trends are very similar across students and researchers. So it's not that only students are really using Google Scholar, faculty and researchers are using it just as much. The problem with that for both publishers and libraries is that all of our access workflows are predicated on the user either being in the physical library through IP authentication or using workflows that the library has control over. So going from the learning management system or going from the discovery service. So when the user actually wants to access content, having seen it in Google Scholar or mentioned in a tweet or recommended by a friend, it can be very confusing and time-consuming to get to that content. So in the user studies that we ran, we found that it took an average of 12 clicks to get from a citation or a reference to a particular paper on the open web behind the paywall to the content, and an average of 3.5 minutes for the student to actually get to that content. So we don't actually have that many studies on what the loss in usage is, but we can infer, and there's been some very interesting reports coming out of the last 2 years of COVID, where we saw that as users had to access library content off campus and using their preferred tools, Google Scholar and others, there were dramatic decreases in the usage of library subscribed content. So Boston University here saw a 45% decline in 2020 versus 2019 as a result of that move off campus. Some of that might be because less learning and less research was being done, but it doesn't account for that particular number. And it's supported by many librarians telling us that they saw spikes in e-resource access problems from their students and researchers, where they didn't find the content, weren't able to get through behind the paywall. And I think many more users we don't see that just simply give up along the way. And I can certainly say from my own experience that if it takes me too long to find something, even if my library may have it at the end of the day, I'll just look for something else. So this is what I wanted to show you that we're working on at Technology from Sage. This is the browser extension I mentioned earlier, Lean Library Futures. And if you're not familiar with browser extensions, you can download them and host them on any desktop that you have. They're compatible with any browser as well. And the idea is that it really sits in your online workflow. And actually, they can be very powerful for lots of different use cases, not just the ones that I'm showing here. So what I want to show you here is, what I want to show you here is an example journey of some of the different areas where we help improve some of those access problems. So if you can see it, the browser extension is indicated by that little library logo on the right-hand side, which says Cardiff University. It's probably very small. And we can deploy things into the online workflow from that little, we call it the workflow librarian, but basically from that browser extension. And we can do it on any website. The first thing that we do is improve the links in Google Scholar to take students and researchers directly to the library's discovery layer, and from there we smooth the back end so they can get straight to the subscribed PDF. And you can see little indicators that that's been successful. We also help flag where the library has access. So this means that on any website that a user from the library may go to where they have a subscription, regardless of how subscription is managed, it may be through established authentication routes, or it could be a simple password system or some other kind of token-based system. We can always provide the users with the details there and then by using our browser extension. So that helps address that loss in usage, because you can say in the user's workflow at the point of need that they have access and they don't need to give up. You can see that working behind the scenes. Again, the advantage of the browser extension is we can do this anywhere. And we can do it against DOIs and EISBNs. So even when you're looking at content on Amazon, as a user is here, we can say, actually, you don't need to buy that ebook because your library has access to that ebook from the publisher, and they can go and grab that there. We were also talking in the chat earlier about open access. So here you can see a user going to a publisher site where the library does not have access. Ordinarily, the user would be invited to pay for the article or to subscribe to the issue. We have found a legal open access alternative, and we use the browser extension to surface a link to that, and we indicate what kind of open access version it is. I think in this case, it's the publisher version. So our use, in the way that we promote this to libraries, we talk about, of course, the cost saving, but to you, I would say this is a way of avoiding illegal routes to open materials, and we know so many researchers and students are using Sci-Hub and others for that. And then this is just an example of how it can be achieved on media sites as well. So on sites like the New York Times, where they don't follow the traditional authentication routes. So that's some of the ways that we support that improved process and access. There are also many other initiatives in the sector, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, like Get FTR and Seamless Access, and there are other tools like ours as well. So I think we're headed in the right direction in that sense, in trying to improve the means by which our end users access content. And returning to that point about what's happening, where access is not as good as we'd like it to be, we know firsthand that as soon as you can improve those routes to access, usage dramatically increases. So this is an example of one of our library customers, NHS Merseycare, and you can see across all publishers, after they'd implemented Lean Library, a dramatic increase in the usage of their subscribed publisher content, which doesn't correlate to any specific year-on-year indications about maybe wanting to use one publisher over another. It's pretty consistent that there's a 40% increase across the board. And I think if we can all focus on making it as easy as possible for students and researchers to access content behind the paywall, going from their preferred routes via Google and Google Scholar, we'll all see increased usage as a result. But it's not just about making it easier to access content that the user already knows they want to get to. It's also about improving discovery as well. So this is another extract from that report that I mentioned earlier, Librarians and Librarian Futures. And here we found, interviewing students and researchers and also librarians, that although they are preferring these tools outside of the library, they would like to see guided discovery embedded in their workflows. So they'd like the ability to be able to bring lots of different discovery tools nested alongside each other in one kind of Uber discovery service. So you can see there, librarians considering desirable as well as patrons, and also that particularly good quote about the idea of integrating all these different tools together. Because although most discovery workflows begin on Google and Google Scholar, it doesn't mean that researchers and students aren't also using Web of Science, Scopus, and others. In fact, to speak for myself, I probably use Google Scholar the most, but then I do go to Web of Science separately if I want to focus on a smaller set of data. And this is relevant to publishers because, of course, publishers are also discovery tools. They have fantastic databases in particular disciplines, and these are the kind of things that we would like to surface to users at their point of need when they are searching for similar terms. So this is an example of how we do this in the browser extension. So we have an integration here I'm going to show you with JSTOR, where if the user chooses to, they can automatically bring in JSTOR search results alongside Google Scholar search results, or indeed any other discovery tool online, whether it's Wikipedia, Web of Science, Scopus, some of the new search tools as well. Just to show you that one more time, in case you missed that. So you have the normal Google Scholar page, and that little box to the right is deployed by the browser extension, and we have the JSTOR results as well. And we do that by integrating with JSTOR's API, so we can scrape the search term from any web page, push it through that API, and deliver that little preview. The second aspect of enhancing discovery is this idea of us living, I think, right now in an age of information surfeit, where there's almost too much for anyone to get hold of. And so there's a focus from both the end user and from libraries on how they can help curate the discovery process and give that added layer of quality control. And again, when we asked librarians and patrons whether they would like support for this in their workflow, there was a lot of interest in having that support in their workflow for being able to see quality curated content that comes from the library while they're in these open search tools. With this particularly telling quote that knowing a librarian curated the content gives me more confidence in the content's credibility. And of course, one of the main means by which librarians curate content is working with publishers that have credibility in a particular field. So this is another type of integration that we have with the publisher, in this case, Sage Research Methods, where we can enhance content discovery for that particular database. So we take a database from Sage Research Methods of keywords, and we use a taxonomy around those keywords to then be able to identify those keywords anywhere the user is working online, highlight those keywords, and bring in preview content. And this can be adapted by the library, can also be adapted by the publisher. So you can have it so that it only works on certain websites, it only works for certain terms, and the idea is that we want to try and get the usage that's often being missed out because of this move to finding the open resources that are just easier to access. So in this case, where a student may often rely on Wikipedia for their research methods guidance, we can bring in Sage Research Methods, which has much more information and has that quality control aspect to it. And as I was mentioning earlier with the browser extension, the power of that is that this can really be done anywhere. So this is an example on YouTube. Where we can publish a video that's relevant to the search results onto the page. So in this case, the user clicks their browser extension, they click to bring in library content, and a relevant video from Sage Research Methods that matches the search term in YouTube that we've scraped comes through. And in this particular example, we only see one publisher because that's just the only relevant video content we had from that. But what we would like to do over time with more publisher integrations is be able to give a range of options to the user. And also we're constantly trying to update this in line with user preferences. So right now we think that the concept of the user pulling this themselves rather than it being pushed by the browser extension makes sense. It's a user-first approach, but if the user wants to, we may change this so that they can have some additional content appear to them by default if they choose to do so on certain sites. And just before saying a word on this, we've only just launched the discovery integrations that I showed you there last year, at the end of last year. So we only have one or two case studies so far. We have one case study with a university in the US that used an integration like that for their LibGuides, for their library guides material, and they saw a dramatic increase in usage as a result. And we're working on case studies with Sage Research Methods and JSTOR and other publishers where we expect to see a similar increase in usage. It's not particularly, it's not particularly brain teasing. It's just that as you promote your content more to users, that usage will go up. We know one of the problems that libraries always have when they subscribe to new publisher databases is getting the word out to their users. And what we're trying to do with our browser extension is help the library do that. And here are some examples here of what we would need from publishers to integrate. So what we really need for the discovery integration is either an API or a very simple JSON file, even a spreadsheet that just has some kind of taxonomy so that we can access your database in a curated way, and the content that you would like to preview against that keyword from the taxonomy, and then the URL to point users to as well. And we do this for libraries as our customers, so this is in our interest, so it's not, we don't charge publishers for this, but the reason why we do it is because we know that our publishers our libraries want to increase the usage of the publishers they subscribe to. You can see a list there of some of our integration partners, a mix of publishers, library service vendors, and other stakeholders in this space as well. A final word just before coming to questions. So in terms of the uptake of the browser extension, which you've seen here, I think that's probably a question that will most obviously come up. We have about 30% of the university's total population, whether it's students or researchers, using the browser extension, and 350,000 users globally across 150 libraries. So although it requires a download, and therefore you do need to get that user engagement in order to be able to benefit from these in the workflow tools, our confidence is that because we're bringing in so much in that browser extension, we're effectively making it the go-to assistant for the user from their library in their workflow. And with that in mind, we want to keep on bringing more things from the library into that browser extension and more ways of surfacing and enhancing publisher content. Thank you very much.
It's sort of wearily familiar how that approach centers Google and the Google search experience as the main royal road for everybody doing research. I wonder if your own experience doing PhD research bears that out, and for you, most journeys began at Google and Google Scholar.
I have to admit, for me, it was Google Scholar. And I think most of my peers, Google Scholar as well. The only occasion I'm studying education, so it might be different in other fields, but the other, the main use case I had for going to Scopus or Web of Science was when I needed to do more kind of analytics approach, where I needed to say this was the trend in research papers, and I could use those quality indexes that are really trusted and that have that. Ironically, in education, I found that if I only used Scopus and Web of Science, whilst not being as intuitive as Google Scholar, they also would miss quite a few of the papers that I needed because they are that smaller pool of papers, which obviously is a good thing for them. But when you're struggling to find a reference for your very esoteric piece of work, you'll take any academic paper you can get. Probably shouldn't say that in front of my supervisors, but I think that's the honest truth.
So you mentioned usage metrics, and with my counter hat on, I need to ask, you talked about growing total usage, but you seem to be referring to usage from specific institutions. So are we actually talking about overall growth in usage for the publisher, or are we talking about the library being able to see increased usage of the content to which they have subscribed?
Yes,
or
good question. At the moment, it's just via the libraries in question, because those are our customers. So that particular example that you gave, it was showing that library's usage of that publisher content had gone up by those metrics year on year. If we were to be able to talk about it at a global level, I think we would need to be able to find ways of streamlining access to subscribed content through the browser extension that didn't require us to have a direct relationship with the library. At the moment, the way that we do it is we need the library's holdings information and all of their authentication infrastructure. But there are other initiatives out there that don't take that library route, like GetFTR and others. So I think those ultimately address the same problem, but just with a slightly, so I think those are positive trends as well.
Thank you. The reason that I asked, just for clarity, is that when I've been speaking with publishers, they've been telling me that it's usually a fairly low proportion of their total usage that is actually attributable to any particular institution. 20% is a number that I hear bandied around quite a lot. So I was interested to know if this was growing that total capacity or the slice that was an institution. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that's very fair, actually. I mean, in our case, I can only, because the libraries are our customer as opposed to the publisher, I can only talk about the reason why they would subscribe to us. And honestly, the main reason is they want to increase the usage of their collection, of their publisher content. So in that respect, we live or die by whether we can show them that. But in the grand scheme of things, it's always going to be a smaller pool because, there are like 20,000 plus institutions. And although we have a lot of the big ones, it's, I think as we grow, we're still going to be focused on those larger institutions.
So in one of the charts, you showed the difference in usage, pre and post improvements. There was also a decrease in one of the publishers' usage.
There was,
Just
yeah.
curious to know what would lead to that. Yeah, that one, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's quite a significant decrease. Just interested why there is a decrease.
I can't specifically remember for this one. It's Walter's Clue, isn't it, if I remember? Yeah, I think it's something to do with a research project in the prior year that didn't replicate in the year after. It's that kind of thing. It's normally things like that, or it's that they cancelled a subscription or something. And that's why we look at the trend line across all the publishers. So that would explain the outlier in that case. The other outlier here is probably EBSCO, and you might be curious, because you'd expect the larger publishers that have a bigger slice of the pie to have particularly pronounced increase, but EBSCO being above them in some cases doesn't quite make sense until you realize that the content that libraries subscribe to via EBSCO from multiple publishers is often at the receiving end of the most difficult access issues, because what happens in those cases, if you're coming from the Google Scholar route, is you arrive at the publisher site, let's say it's Taylor & Francis, and Taylor & Francis doesn't know that your institution has access to that content because, as far as they're concerned, you only have access to it via the EBSCO route. So that's why we see the increased usage on the EBSCO and ProQuest lines always particularly pronounced.
Okay, interestingly, I come from Taylor and Francis, and I think I know how to connect the dots, but we'll take it offline. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, hello? Yeah, is there any correlation between the grades of the students that use those libraries using your tool compared to those that don't?
Yes and no. We haven't actually yet worked out how to map our user data with grade point averages or information that the library holds. Actually, at the moment, that browser extension is completely accessed anonymously, so we don't have user profiles. We don't really know who's using it. All I can tell you is the total uptake across the university. We only know qualitatively by holding workshops or interviews within the university to find out who's using it. But we do intend to bring in user profiles over the next few years if users opt into them, which would help us do that. But the yes bit that I can point to is that a lot of the libraries that we work with have done case studies on whether increased usage of the library's collection correlates with improved learning outcomes. And they've done it in particular to justify the investment in our reading list solution, the one that we didn't look at, but the one at the start, Talus Aspire, which helps connect the recommendations that the faculty have for reading into the learning management system. So a lot of our libraries have done case studies for that to justify the continued use year on year. And where they do that, they definitely notice that those students that access the content via the learning management system and read more of the prescribed material have better learning outcomes. So I'm pretty confident that if we can connect the dots over the next few years, it would show that increased usage of the library's collection does correlate with learning outcomes, which will be really important for the library to show in a time where their budgets are under pressure and their role is evolving.
Yeah, because I'm looking at this. If you do get the correlation between what people are looking at next to grades, then maybe we can start going to because we're doing a lot to teach machines how to do things, but we're getting very close to machines learning how to teach us to be better as far as your academic choices are concerned.
Yeah, I suppose there's whether you feel some of this might be spoon feeding students too much. You know, if you're overly recommending particular items of content while they're in their discovery process, and there definitely are some librarians that would criticize that and would say that actually part of your training as a student should be that whole independent discovery process. But then there are others that say this is the world that we live in, and actually there's just too much information to navigate through without having guidance.
That's an interesting debate about end justifying the means. You know, I need to get this score. How do I get that score? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, personally, because it kind of relates to, it's very separate, but my PhD is all about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and about how you can mobilize youth action. And I'm interested there in the mix between action that helps the student progress in their career and in their university applications versus action that's a societal benefit. And actually, I think in that particular case, if you can blend the two, if it can be both good for them to progress and good for society, that's the way to go. And I would take the same approach personally to things like this, that actually, yeah, of course the student wants to get a good learning outcome, and there'll be some gamification in that, but if we can harness that for a better learning process, that's only a good thing.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And make sure you stay in that space so you can influence it.
Kim Morello, I'm from a small biomedical publisher, and I'm just wondering, obviously we're seeing, and you explained why we're seeing these massive increases on things like the Wiley platform and Elsevier and EBSCO. But as a small publisher, I'm just wondering, do you have any idea, kind of a couple of years down the line into this usage, whether facilitating access to those very large bodies of journals, in our case, whether that comes at any cost to smaller publishers who might just have one journal or society journals, because, you know, sort of picking up on your comment earlier, any paper will do. I also did a PhD. I know that feeling that if you can't get easily to something, and I accept that if it's making our access to our content easier, then that's great too, and hopefully we would still see increased usage. But I just wondered if you've got enough data to see a feel for that, that as it's easier to get into these very large areas of research, literature, does that come at any cost anywhere else?
Yes, I think it does actually. I can't directly connect the dots, but if you look at the trends, I think you're definitely right. I think that because the largest publishers are generally favored anyway, not deliberately, but sort of coincidentally by the big discovery engines, that in itself does make the problem worse. In our particular case, the access streamlining bit works for all publishers because we just integrate with the library. We don't need to integrate with the publisher. But I think that that problem of the usage going to the larger publishers is definitely true. And there are issues where Google Scholar will not index certain types of content, for example, which privilege some publishers over others. And there's also general preference amongst users for academic articles over ebook chapters that may be an issue for some publishers. I would hope that what we could do here is that where we partner directly with publishers to improve the discovery in the workflow via that keyword mapping and that discovery tool, there the idea is to say, look, you as a library have just invested in this new database and you want it to get it promoted to your users. Let's surface it to them every time they're searching for relevant terms on these sites. And that, I think, should help those smaller publishers get greater recognition. Otherwise, I do agree that it's a difficult contest, because if the library subscribes but then doesn't really get it out there and it's not being prescribed by faculty, it's not being disseminated across campus, I think it's a challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Nice to meet you. Yeah.